There are 40 million more women active in the workforce as compared to 10 years ago across the entire Muslim world. In Indonesia, that's 7 million more women. In Pakistan, about the same, 7 million more women. In Turkey, about 2 million more. In Malaysia, 1 million more. And across the entire Arab world, 9 million more women in the workplace. So one critical factor is a massive investment has been made on women's education, women and girls' education across the region. There are almost no countries in the region where there's any losses happening in women's education. So let's take Saudi Arabia as an example. 10 years ago, out of all of the women that could be in the cohort of being in university, 30% of them were enrolled in universities. Today, 50% of all women that could be in that cohort are enrolled in universities. That is higher than China, higher than India, higher than Brazil. Education has this multiplier effect on families, on communities. We know that educated women spend money differently. They take consumption decisions in the home that are more geared towards education and health of the next generation. But there's something more than that, and that is their aspirations are changing. They want to go into the workplace. They want to be a part of their economies. They don't want to be educated and then not use that education in the workplace. And that's where we're seeing some of the biggest shifts. None of that is to say that there still aren't massive problems. So for example, what I'm telling you about is how fast this change is happening. But if you look at the absolute numbers, there's still a pretty big problem. Women's labor force participation is still about half that of men. So overall, there's still a lot of change that needs to be made. There's still a lot of women that are going to university but not using their education. There's still a lot of women that are at home and in structures where they don't even necessarily want change. There are a lot of lower income women that are not getting the same opportunities. And interestingly, in some of these economies, there's almost a premium placed on being able to stay at home. What has changed is there's a set of women that are the first in their families for generations who have ever stepped outside of the home to work and who are bringing in an income. Let's take a company as an example. McDonald's is present in Pakistan, and in the last 15 years or so, they've really expanded. And they've made it a deliberate policy to try to bring in some of these women from lower income families who have all got their first undergraduate education or are in the midst of doing it, but they all come from families where their mothers have never worked, where none of their cousins, aunts, nobody has worked. So there is no role model of somebody working, but at the same time, they're getting an income, they're getting a very safe workplace, they're getting transport to the workplace, and so somehow the families, after understanding what that model means, are actually starting to accept it. Another example to perhaps look at is Saudi Arabia. Now there's a very particular kind of culture, there's some very particular kind of rules as to how men and women should interact in public, but mechanisms are being put in place to try to make things easier for women. So for example, certain companies are trying to have women and men working in different floors because that's what's required, but they're having them video conference with each other. And that's how it has to work if this change is going to happen within a certain kind of culture. So governments need to be thinking about policy completely differently. They need to be thinking, if we're going to tap into this highly educated workforce, what are the mechanisms we're going to have to create? A second piece is how are businesses going to adapt? And I'm talking about both multinationals that are active in these countries and who are trying to set their global diversity policies, and then they come into one of these countries and they hit up against a wall. So they're going to have to know exactly what they should be doing, what to tap into, what the trends are, and what would be acceptable locally. But also the local companies. I was in Riyadh last year, and there was a conference which was trying to play a matchmaking role between university graduates or young women who were about to graduate and companies that were looking to recruit more women. And most of these women had no idea that they're part of this very positive trend. They actually thought, oh, there are a lot of barriers, this is going to be very hard, we're not sure there's anybody else who wants to do this. And I think one of the things that is really going to change in the next 10 years is that sense of, oh, we are part of this change, this is positive, there is acceleration, and it's now increasingly acceptable for me to be doing this. I'm not the only person. And then most of all, I think the change is going to come from when women are in the workplace in much higher numbers, when they have much more income of their own, they're going to be taking very different decisions.